January 17th, 1991, 2:38 a.m. Baghdad should have been glowing on every radar screen. Instead, the screens were empty. Inside a hardened air defense bunker near the outskirts of the Iraqi capital, Soviet-trained technicians sat frozen, staring into nothing. Just moments earlier, they'd run through the standard pre-strike checklist: antenna sweep, elevation scan, frequency calibration. Everything was normal. The sky was calm. The threat horizon was clear. Then the earth shook. A low thump, then another. Not from missiles, not from artillery. These were internal explosions, surgical, precise, and terrifying. Military command posts, telephone exchanges, airfields, communication hubs, hit in coordinated sequence, perfectly timed. But no enemy was visible. Operators screamed across headsets, demanding updates. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the sky. The network's layered radar bands, high-altitude tracking, medium-range surveillance, low-level acquisition, all showed nothing. No aircraft, no contrails, no jamming signals. Yet Baghdad was under attack. Outside the bunker, the night sky erupted with orange plumes. Sirens wailed. Ammunition depots crackled into secondary detonations. An entire division headquarters buried beneath concrete vanished in a white-hot flash. Still, the radar screens remained blank. Over a dozen Soviet-designed tracking systems from P-15s to SNR-75s registered zero contact. These were the same systems that had tracked American U-2s and shot down F-4 Phantoms. Systems that formed the backbone of Warsaw Pact air defense. Systems that were supposed to be unbreakable. And yet something had broken them. Over the next 42 minutes, 17 precision strikes ripped through Baghdad's core infrastructure. And the defenders never saw a single jet, not even once. In the corner of the bunker, a Soviet advisor named Major Viktor Yegorov picked up a secure handset. The line crackled all the way to Moscow. He spoke 6 words. Baghdad is under attack, from nothing. 15 minutes later, another report came in. Same message, different city, Kuwait City. Also hit, also blind, also silent. Moscow had trained them to track planes, but the Americans had sent ghosts 7 months earlier. The conference room at Iraq's Air Defense Command headquarters in Baghdad was sweltering. Soviet advisors, clad in pressed uniforms, sat across from high-ranking Iraqi officers. Blueprints lay spread across the table, overlapping SAM rings, radar coverage arcs, mobile launcher dispersal plans. On paper, it was an airtight system. Colonel Yevgeny Sidorov, a Soviet air defense advisor from the 2nd PVO Army, tapped a pencil against a strategic map. "Your radar lattice is denser than any we've seen outside Moscow," he said. "You've got full coverage, low, mid, high altitude. The Americans can't hide." General Abdul Karim of the Iraqi Air Defense Force nodded, smirking. "Let them come. The desert will be their graveyard." The room burst into quiet laughter. They had reason to be confident. Baghdad's airspace was protected by over 3,000 surface-to-air missiles and a network of 16,000 anti-aircraft guns. The Soviets had trained Iraqi crews for over a decade. Systems ranged from SA-2 Volgas to modern SA-6 Gainfuls, supplemented with radar-guided tape-away and fire control bunkers hardened against bombing. On the walls, grainy photos showed past victories. American planes shot down during the 1980s. Israeli jets forced to retreat. Every kill was a triumph of radar logic. Detect, track, lock, fire. That sequence had held for decades. There was no reason to question it. Sidorov laid out the doctrine again. They fly, we see. They launch, we shoot. They evade, we saturate. Their ECM is noisy, predictable. Their aircraft, bright as streetlights. One Iraqi colonel asked about stealth. A junior Soviet analyst chuckled. "You mean the American triangle? The black one? It can't carry much, if it even exists." Sidorov nodded in agreement. "Stealth is marketing. Physics doesn't lie. If it reflects any signal, we'll see it. Another officer chimed in, tapping a radar schematic. And if we don't see it, we'll hear it. It was a closed circle of logic. Radar was king. Infrared backed it. Optical sighting closed gaps. Even if one system missed, another would catch. Baghdad was a fortress wrapped in electronics. As the meeting wrapped, Sidorov stood confidently. They may have fancy planes, but we have the sky. Smiles, nods, coffee was poured, and their laughter was the first mistake. To understand why Baghdad's air defenses failed, one must understand what they were designed to stop. For decades, Soviet air defense doctrine was the most sophisticated on Earth. A doctrine built not on a single system but on the idea of redundancy. Multiple radar bands, multiple missile ranges, overlapping kill zones. Everything predicated on one assumption. If it flies, it reflects. If it reflects, it dies. This was the legacy of the Great Patriotic War, forged in the blood of Stalingrad and refined during the Cold War. Western aircraft, from the F-4 to the F-15, had always relied on speed, altitude, or electronic jamming. The Soviet answer had been volume and geometry. Saturate the airspace with radar coverage, blanket it with missiles, and light up the sky with gunfire. In theory, no aircraft could cross the Soviet air defense net without being seen and shot. The system operated like a pyramid. At the top were strategic surveillance radars, capable of tracking high-flying aircraft hundreds of kilometers out. Below them were fire control radars guiding missile batteries like the SA-2 and SA-6. At the base were gun-laying systems directing thousands of anti-aircraft barrels at anything that slipped through. Command posts, connected by fiber optic lines and buried deep underground, coordinated intercepts using ground-controlled intercept, GCI logic. Targets were tracked in 3 dimensions, assigned threat levels, and met with escalating firepower. But this intricate doctrine depended on one thing above all: radar visibility. An aircraft could jam. It could evade. It could dive and flare. But it could not vanish. That was the rule. Even the Americans had played by it. U-2s flew high, SR-71s flew fast, F-15s flew with ECM pods. But they all showed up. They all gave something to track. In Soviet war rooms, stealth was treated like a gimmick, a novelty for air shows and budget proposals. The concept of a jet with no radar return, no heat bloom, no radio emission, it bordered on sorcery. No doctrine accounted for it. No officer trained against it. Baghdad was the test, and the test would shatter everything. The first F-117 crossed into Iraqi airspace at 2:38 a.m. It flew alone. No escort, no jamming support, no fighter screen. Just a single angular shape, cutting through the night air above the desert, utterly invisible. Its target was a critical command and control center in downtown Baghdad. Deep inside the city, buried beneath reinforced concrete, it was the neural hub of Iraq's integrated air defenses. Dozens of Soviet-made radars, missile batteries, and flak positions depended on its coordination. The mission profile was precise. Approach at medium altitude, descend to just under 5,000 feet, drop 2 laser-guided GBU-27 bombs, then exfiltrate northward through a radar gap the Americans had mapped weeks earlier. As the jet glided toward the city, every layer of Baghdad's defenses stood alert. The sky bristled with Soviet-designed systems. SA-2s for high altitude, SA-6s for mid-range, ZSU-23-4s scanning low. Mobile units prowled the city's outskirts. Flak guns dotted rooftops. Every possible altitude, angle, and approach had been calculated. Yet no one saw it. Not one radar pinged. Not one heat-seeker locked. Not one alarm was raised. Over the Tigris River, the F-117's bomb bay doors opened. 2 precision bombs dropped. 10 seconds later, a thunderous burst tore through the heart of the city. The bunker collapsed inward, silencing the air defense brain in an instant. By the time anyone reacted, the jet was already turning back, flying into blackness, vanishing between 2 radar nodes whose signals had never touched its surface. The Iraqi command was in chaos. Officers screamed into radios demanding targets, but the radar screens were blank. Technicians rebooted systems, generators roared. Nothing. Soviet advisors frantically checked the logs. They found no anomalies, no signal loss, no jamming signatures. The systems had been functioning perfectly, and they had seen nothing. By sunrise, word had spread. The Americans had hit 20 targets across the city. Ammunition depots, intelligence headquarters, power stations, communications relays, all hit, all by something no one could see. In one bunker, a Soviet major replayed radar logs frame by frame. No glitches, no spikes, no error codes. Just silence. Then he whispered, barely audible under the hum of electronics, "This should not have been possible." The first encrypted reports from Baghdad reached Moscow before sunrise. They were confusing and terrifying. Multiple high-value targets in the Iraqi capital had been struck simultaneously. Ammunition depots, communications hubs, intelligence centers. The attacks were surgical, timed to the second. But the most chilling part? Every radar site reported the same anomaly. No anomaly at all. The screens had remained clean. No enemy aircraft, no incoming threats. No spikes in radio signals, just explosions, alarms, and silence. Soviet-made Volgas and Gainfuls had stood ready. The radar crews had waited. No one had seen the enemy. The General Staff convened an emergency session in a bunker outside Moscow. Dozens of advisors and electronic warfare specialists gathered around a central projector. Data scrolled across the screen. Radar logs, frequency sweeps, thermal readings, all blank. At the back of the room, a young lieutenant colonel leaned forward and said what no one else wanted to hear. "They hit Baghdad with invisible aircraft." The room went still. Then laughter. A KGB analyst scoffed. "Invisible? We trained those men. They must have missed something." A senior officer slammed his fist on the table. "Impossible. Stealth is theater. We ran the numbers. It's vaporware." They offered other explanations. Electronic jamming, radar spoofing, high-altitude deception, internal sabotage. Some even blamed the Americans for staging the damage using local proxies. No one seriously considered that the Americans had built a combat aircraft that physics could not track, because that would mean the doctrine itself was broken. Memos were issued to Baghdad. Recheck frequency calibrations, rotate radar patterns, conduct nighttime drills. Operators were advised to look for non-radar indicators, sound, heat, visual cues. The official line? Nothing had failed. This was enemy trickery. But inside the Defense Ministry, anxiety spread like smoke, because other reports were trickling in. Kuwait, hit, no radar contact. Basra, hit, no radar contact. Tikrit, hit, no radar contact. 3 cities, dozens of hits, 0 confirmed aircraft. Some staffers began whispering about the ghost jets. Others mocked them, for now. But in the war rooms of the Soviet command structure, something sacred was eroding, the belief that if a system works perfectly, it cannot lose. They chose to believe in the radar, because believing in anything else would mean facing the truth, and the truth was too dangerous. When the first wave of F-117 strikes left no radar trace, Moscow had a choice: confront the impossible or invent the logical. They chose the latter. Within days of the attacks, the Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering released a preliminary analysis. It rejected the notion of true radar invisibility. Instead, it proposed a high-probability hypothesis. The Americans had developed a plasma-based stealth shield, a gas envelope that ionized around the aircraft to bend incoming radar waves. On paper, it made sense. Plasma had long fascinated Soviet physicists. It could theoretically scatter electromagnetic energy. If modulated, it might even absorb radar signals. The theory matched Soviet expectations: advanced, complex, but ultimately defeatable. And most importantly, it didn't require rewriting the laws of air defense. The explanation spread quickly through classified briefings. Memos described temporary field nullification, non-Newtonian signal suppression, and frequency-selective transparency. The terms sounded scientific, authoritative, satisfying. They told commanders that their systems hadn't failed. They'd just been tricked by a new form of exotic masking. The alternative, that the Americans had shaped aircraft from radar-absorbing materials, stripped them of emission signatures, and guided them by satellite, was dismissed as fantasy. Soviet doctrine insisted that stealth could reduce detection ranges but never eliminate them. So the plasma theory became official. Soviet air defense engineers were told to adapt. Radar arrays were instructed to recalibrate across wider frequency bands. Field manuals added plasma dispersion modules as a new threat classification. Even war games simulated engagements against hypothetical plasma-cloaked aircraft. None of it helped. Meanwhile, the F-117s flew untouched. Every night they returned to Baghdad. Every night they dropped precision payloads. And every night the radars stayed blind. But back in Moscow, the illusion held. The plasma theory explained away the failure without challenging the doctrine. It let generals keep their systems, engineers keep their reputations, and scientists keep their funding. It was elegant. It was technical. It was completely wrong. But in 1991, they believed it. Because the truth, that American stealth was real, operational, and unstoppable, was unthinkable. When the plasma stealth theory began to crumble under its own contradictions, Moscow reached for something even further from reality. They blamed fiction. By late January 1991, Soviet analysts were flooded with battlefield reports that defied every metric they trusted. Multiple strikes occurred without warning. Iraqi radar logs were clean. Heat sensors detected nothing. There were no communication intercepts, no jamming patterns. The aircraft seemed to enter, attack, and leave, as if they never existed at all. And so another explanation emerged. This time it wasn't physics. It was sabotage. A classified report circulated among a small circle of Soviet generals in early February. It claimed that the Americans had infiltrated Iraqi radar systems at the software level, corrupting signal processing algorithms to delete real targets from the screen. The term used was ghost nulling. In this theory, the jets weren't stealthy. They were being erased in real time. One KGB technical officer pushed it further. He theorized the F-117s were flying in sync with orbital satellites, timing their approach so that radar sweeps were disrupted by synchronized signal loops. The idea bordered on the absurd, jets surfing on the blind spots of spy satellites. Others spiraled deeper into speculation. A former GRU cyber warfare officer briefed a committee on the possibility of electromagnetic camouflage, an airborne projector that bent light and radar alike, creating a hologram effect. He cited outdated CIA patents and obscure physics journals. One colonel proposed that the bombs were launched from space, dropped from stealth satellites disguised as orbital debris. Another suggested that American stealth was a disinformation campaign, that the bombs were planted by special forces, and the F-117 was a decoy program meant to embarrass Soviet technology. Each theory built upon the last. Each one became more desperate. Because the simplest explanation, that the Americans had developed an aircraft capable of flying undetected through the most defended airspace on Earth, was too devastating to accept. So the Soviet mind turned inward. Paranoia replaced clarity. Doctrine replaced science. What couldn't be explained was renamed. What couldn't be seen was dismissed. They weren't facing reality. They were solving a problem that didn't exist. When Soviet doctrine failed, Moscow turned to its second shield, intelligence. If their systems couldn't detect the threat, perhaps their spies could explain it. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, deployed urgent assets across Iraq. Advisors embedded with Iraqi air defense units were ordered to collect raw radar logs, signal spectrums, and missile battery transcripts from the first 72 hours of Desert Storm. Meanwhile, field agents interrogated captured American ordnance remnants, hoping to find transmission chips, radar reflectors, or homing devices, anything that might demystify the silent assault. They found nothing. The fragments of bombs were conventional. Laser-guided, yes, but traceable. They yielded no secrets. The guidance systems left no electronic trail. The bombs were dumb, made smart only by a plane that could aim them from invisibility. Simultaneously, the KGB launched parallel efforts. Through front companies and cutouts, they tried to bribe Lockheed Martin subcontractors. They probed logistics hubs in Nevada and Arizona. They tracked the movements of American engineering talent, hoping to identify the brains behind the supposed stealth program. But the Americans had buried the truth under layers of secrecy. Compartmentalization meant no single engineer understood the full system. One designed the wing shape, another tested the ram coating, a third configured avionics. No one person knew how the Ghost was built. What little information the KGB did obtain only deepened the confusion. A high-level source hinted that the F-117 carried no active radar, no electronic emissions, and relied entirely on GPS and inertial navigation. That made no sense. Soviet doctrine taught that no aircraft could fly blind. But this one did, by design. Worse still, American stealth testing had been conducted at night, outside satellite windows. Every prototype flight had been masked by coordinated satellite blackout zones. No satellite photo existed of a full F-117 before it entered service. They hadn't just built a new plane. They had built a new way of war. Back in Moscow, the GRU compiled a final report. It contained no blueprints, no breakthroughs, no captured components. Its conclusion was a single line. We are not looking at a machine. We are looking at an absence. Soviet intelligence had always trusted in patterns, in frequencies, hardware, routines. But the F-117 had no pattern, no signal, no presence. They were looking at a ghost. It wasn't a single breakthrough. It was an ecosystem of engineering decisions, each one aimed not at superiority but at erasure. The F-117 Nighthawk wasn't a plane that beat Soviet systems in combat. It was a plane that removed combat from the equation entirely. The starting point was shape. In the 1970s, a Lockheed engineer named Dennis Overholzer stumbled on an obscure Soviet paper, written by physicist Peter Ufimtsev, that detailed how electromagnetic waves scattered off flat surfaces. The Soviets had dismissed it as theoretical. The Americans turned it into design. The F-117's faceted exterior wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast. But every surface deflected radar waves away from their source. Instead of returning a clean signal, the jets scattered it like light through shattered crystal. There were no curves, no predictable reflections. It didn't shine back. It vanished. Soviet radar expected echoes. The Nighthawk gave it static. Then came skin. The jet was coated in radar-absorbent material, RAM, a composite skin that absorbed electromagnetic energy and converted it into low-level heat. That heat was then dissipated through its chassis, leaving nothing for radar receivers to grab. Combined with its shape, the result was staggering. A radar cross-section of just 0.001 square meters, smaller than a bird, less than a metal ball bearing. Baghdad's radars weren't blind. They just weren't tuned to see something that small, that deliberate, and that silent. Next, internalization. Unlike conventional aircraft that carried bombs on external pylons, which reflected radar like mirrors, the F-117's weapons were hidden. Its bay doors remained sealed until the final seconds of a strike run. They opened for mere moments, released a precision-guided GBU-27 or GBU-10, then slammed shut. Every second those doors were open was a vulnerability, so engineers made sure they weren't open long. The engines were buried deep inside the fuselage. Air intakes curved in S-shapes to shield fan blades, the most radar-reflective surface on any jet. The exhaust nozzles were flattened and cooled with ambient airflow to minimize infrared signature. Heat-seeking missiles had nothing to follow. Even if you could see it, you couldn't catch it. Even if you caught it, you couldn't lock on. Then there was flight control. The F-117 was inherently unstable. Its geometry made it unflyable by a human. But its computer fly-by-wire system adjusted thousands of times per second, maintaining equilibrium. While Soviet jets relied on raw pilot skill and airframe stability, the F-117 flew on algorithms. And it flew silently. There was no active radar. No comms chatter, no IFF transponder. It navigated by inertial guidance, constantly recalibrated with satellite GPS updates. A terrain-following system allowed it to fly low between radar nets. The jet did not announce itself. It did not call for support. It did not paint targets. It appeared, struck, and left. That was it. For targeting, it used a forward-looking infrared sensor, FEL-IR, and laser designator, guiding bombs without radar emissions. The system could recognize a target's shape and temperature from kilometers away. Soviet defenses designed to track radiating energy found nothing, because the F-117 gave off nothing. No noise, no heat, no light, no return. Even the maintenance was compartmentalized. RAM coatings were kept in sealed hangars. Logistics crews were cleared only for their specific systems. It was a black box inside a black budget. The Soviets had watched radar for decades, expecting light. The Americans built a weapon of darkness. The F-117 didn't win the radar war. It rendered radar irrelevant. It didn't defeat Baghdad's defenses. It deleted them from the conversation, not by speed, not by firepower, by non-existence. This wasn't air superiority. This was optical denial weaponized. A machine shaped by math, flown by silence, and aimed by light. The Soviets believed that every aircraft left a trace. The F-117 left only wreckage. Night 1. At precisely 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, 20 F-117s slipped into Iraqi airspace. They flew alone. No escorts, no fighter cover, no jamming aircraft. Just 20 matte black triangles slicing through the sky, invisible to radar, inaudible to human ears. They were not part of a broader wave. They were the tip of the war. Their target list read like a blueprint for regime decapitation. Command bunkers, communication relays, telephone exchanges, radar coordination centers, airbase power supplies. Each aircraft carried 2 laser-guided bombs. No more, no less. That was all they needed. In Baghdad, the skies were already alive with anticipation. Iraqi SAM crews had been briefed. Soviet advisors stood by in hardened bunkers. Screens were lit. Targeting systems warmed. Flak towers waited for signals. They got none. The F-117s arrived, opened their bays, released. The first bomb struck a telecommunications hub, severing Iraq's national command link. The second wave cratered an airbase runway near Habaniya. A third obliterated an underground bunker beneath the Ministry of Defense. Each hit came from nowhere. No radar warning, no early scramble. Only the thunder of detonation, and then the blaring of sirens. Too late. Confusion turned to panic. Iraqi generals shouted into dead radios. Soviet engineers recalibrated radar arrays in real time. Operators stared at blank scopes, then up at the sky, desperately scanning for shapes. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire blind, hosing the night with tracers. For 30 minutes, Baghdad's skies exploded with meaningless fury. The F-117s were already gone. Not one was hit. Not one was tracked. Not one was seen. By sunrise, reports emerged. 20 aircraft had struck over 30 targets in Baghdad alone, and all returned to base without a scratch. In the chaos that followed, Iraqi officers accused each other of sabotage. Soviet advisors rechecked logs, then demanded retests. Radar engineers inspected hardware looking for faults. There were none. The systems had worked. The inputs were clean. The radars had been online. And still, they had missed everything. What should have been a showcase of Soviet export air defense, the world's most fortified city under electronic armor, became a demonstration of absolute vulnerability. Baghdad had been turned into a laboratory. The F-117 was the scalpel, and the entire Soviet defense doctrine was on the operating table, exposed, dissected, irrelevant. Not one missile launched in defense landed. Not one enemy was seen. Not one theory held up. The ghost had arrived, and it had passed straight through them. The F-117 didn't just blind Baghdad. It shattered the Soviet worldview. For decades, Soviet strategy had rested on the supremacy of systems, overlapping radars. Centralized intercept control, volumetric firepower, and data-driven battlefield prediction. From the Fulda Gap to the Persian Gulf, their doctrine was a formula. If the enemy flies, detect. If detected, track. If tracked, destroy. Desert Storm broke that chain completely, because the Americans never allowed the chain to start. It wasn't just that the F-117 avoided radar. It rendered radar meaningless. It wasn't jamming, spoofing, or deception. It was subtraction. The removal of an object from the sensory universe of the enemy. And that was something Soviet planners were never trained to confront. In the days that followed the first strikes, Soviet advisors in Baghdad scrambled to adapt. They installed visual spotters. They extended infrared scan zones. They created fallback communications nodes in case of future blackouts. None of it mattered. The problem wasn't the weapons. It was the assumptions. The Soviets had built an empire on 5 pillars. Information comes from objects. If you want to know the enemy, track their equipment. Mass defeats precision. You can always overwhelm a narrow technology with broader force. Detection precedes destruction. If you can't see it, you can't fight it. Defense is geometry. Radar rings, kill boxes, triangulated data. Steel solves problems. Bigger missiles, bigger radars, bigger guns. The F-117 violated all 5, not with cleverness, but with silence. It was not mass, it was minimalism. It was not steel, it was signal denial. It was not geometry. It was ghost logic, striking from outside the perceptual framework Soviet systems were built to operate within. Most damning of all, it proved that information doesn't have to come from visibility. It can be delivered through digital integration. Satellites, terrain mapping, AI-guided target profiles. While the Soviets had radar operators, the Americans had networks. This wasn't just a defeat of hardware. It was the collapse of an idea, that enough coverage, enough range, and enough volume could stop anything. The F-117 didn't just break their radar. It broke their belief in reality as they understood it. Somewhere in the Iraqi desert, half buried in sand, lies the rusting frame of a Soviet-made SNR-75 radar trailer. Its panels are warped, its scope shattered. Its antenna dish, once proud in sweeping the skies, now hangs limp, twisted by a blast it never saw coming. There is no crater nearby, no missile strike, no burn marks, just absence. This was one of the many systems that stood guard over Baghdad in 1991. Systems trusted by their creators, exported with pride, defended with theory. They were built on the belief that war was visible, that threats had shape, and that victory was a matter of physics and fire. But the F-117 never cared for visibility. It didn't announce itself. It didn't engage in dogfights. It didn't duel over battlefields. It simply appeared and removed things from the world. Today, that jet is retired, no longer in combat, no longer patrolling, and yet, it's everywhere. Its silhouette remains classified. Its missions are still redacted. Its legacy, though, is visible in every drone strike, every stealth platform, every AI-guided bombing run that leaves no warning and no trail. The F-117 wasn't a plane. It was the first whisper of a new kind of war. In training simulations across former Soviet states, operators still rehearse detecting low RCS threats. They stare at screens filled with algorithms. They run drills for ghosts. But they are watching for echoes. And the Nighthawk left none. The men who designed Soviet air defense believed in numbers, angles, and certainty. They were engineers of vision. But the F-117 turned vision into vulnerability. Not by defeating their weapons, but by removing the battlefield from their sight entirely. The Cold War didn't end in Berlin. It ended in rooms full of men who refused to believe the truth.